eventually, the head of the Idumeans was a man by the name of Antipater. Chazal always questioned whether the conversions were legitimate because they were forced and because it was a mass conversion. In other words, 10,000 people at one time. So that was one of the disagreements that the rabbis had with the Hashmonaim. Eventually, in 63 before the Common Era, which is 100 years after the Hashmonaim got rid of the Greeks, the Roman general Pompey came to the Middle East. He came to Egypt, and then he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he besieged Jerusalem, and the Hashmonaim were forced to go under Roman rule, but he did not destroy the city, nor did he interfere with the temple. But Chazal held that the handwriting was on the wall. And they knew from the beginning that the Ba'isheni would not survive. And this was the beginning of the end. The Romans instituted their own rulers in the country. Who did they take? They took Antipater because he was in charge of this elite army, and he became a Roman puppet. And he had a son, Herod. And the Romans had taken Hordus to Rome as a hostage to make sure that his father did what they wanted him to do. And Hordus had a Roman education. But Hordus felt himself to be a Jew. When he somehow became friends with the Roman Emperor Claudius, and the emperor appointed Hordus to become a governor of Judea in the land of Israel. And 100 years, in other words, in the year 30 before the Common Era, so Hillel and Shammai rose to be the heads of the Sanhedrin, and Hordus rose to be the Roman governor of Judea. Hordus was a great murderer, and he was a great builder. And we see the buildings that he built all over the country. And the Kotel HaMaravi is from Hordus. Chazal say he rebuilt the entire Second Temple with a magnificence that it never had before. He brought Carrara marble from Italy to pave the floor. The Gemara says that the floor looked like an ocean, like the waves of the sea when the sun hit it. And Chazal say, Mi shelo ra binyan Hordus lo ra binyan Noem miyomov. If you didn't see the second temple that Hordus built, you never saw a beautiful building. And it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And it was the center of a great deal of tourism. And there was a place outside the Azora where non-Jews could stand and see. And this was the glory of the temple. It stood for 100 years, Hordus' temple. There were, amongst the Jews, for a change, there were different factions. So there were those who called themselves, by the way, Hordus' grandson was Agrippa, who Agrippa, the street is named after, and he became the governor of Judea, and he was a righteous person. Chazal say that at the Hakel ceremony on Sukkot, he got up and he read the Chumash Dvorim. And when he came to the part that it says, Lo sasim alecha melech, that who is not Jewish, who is not your brother, so the Gemara says that he wept because he realized that his legitimacy was in question. And the Chazal, the Gemara says one of the punishments of the Jewish people was that they said a chanifa to him. They said to him, Achinu ata, Achinu ata. You're our brother, don't worry about it. We accept you. You're 100% good. Now, if you don't know this, then you don't understand a lot of the problems that exist today and what all the fights are about. Because all of this has cosmic importance, not just political importance. So Agrippus is the king. Agrippus has an army, but he's under Roman domination. There's another group of people who are called the Kanoim. The Kanoim say, we don't want to be ruled by Rome. We want to be independent. We're strong enough. We'll drive the Romans out of the country. Now, the Kanoim were all observant Jews, religious Jews. But Chazal opposed them because they said it was futile and that what they would do would only lead to the destruction of the temple and of the people and of the exile. And therefore, they shouldn't do it. But the Kanoim were very strong. And they had great popular support. So you had Yochanan Gish Chalav, you had others that were led in this effort. There was a third group who were called the Sikrikun. The Sikrikun were the mafia. Sikrikun comes from the Latin word sicrica, which means a short dagger. And that was their weapon. And they were gangsters. The Gemara, the Mishnah especially, discusses many halachic problems because of them. Especially the Gemara in Bava Basra, which deals with real estate. They forced people off the land, they took it. Could you buy land from the Sikrikun? But the Sikrikun joined with the Kanoim to try and drive Rome out of the country. Agrippa, with his army, attempted to stay neutral. But in the end, he could not stay neutral. So you had three Jewish armies. The army of Agrippa, the army of the Kanoim, and the army of the Sikrikun. The Romans were not willing to give up Eretz Yisrael. It was too strategic. It's the central place in the Middle East. And the Romans therefore sent their armies here. Their army was led by a general by the name of Vespasian. Chazal called him Aspasionis. And he brought along his son, who was his assistant general in the army, Titus Arosha. And they began a campaign starting in the year 63 and ending 10 years later in 73. First, they conquered the Galil. and that's where Josephus was a general in the Jewish army, and then he joined the Romans. He wrote the history, the wars of the Jews. A lot of what we know from his book. And they conquered the Galil. Now, the Roman method of conquering was to lay siege to the cities and starve them into submission. And the Romans had great siege machines that they built that were able to break down any of the walls and were able to throw boulders over the height of the walls. Romans were great engineers. After Vespasian conquered the Galil, he came to Yerushalayim. And the siege of Yerushalayim lasted a number of years. But it was a hopeless situation. The Kanoim were so determined not to fall into Roman hands that they forced, the Gemara says that there was a grain warehouse that Hurdas had prepared that could have withstood a siege of years, but that the Kanoim purposely burned it so the people would be forced to fight. And because as long as they had grain, so then they'll wait out the Romans too. Maybe the Romans will get tired. So you see, Chazal had a very negative view of Kanos at the expense of the Jewish people. And eventually, Vespasian is appointed the emperor, so he has to go back to Rome, and he leaves it to his son Titus to complete the siege, which he does. So then we have Shivasar B'Tammuz, when the outer walls finally were breached. It took them 3 weeks to fight from the outer walls until the Temple Mount, but they finally arrived. Now, Josephus is of the opinion that Titus did not want to destroy the temple building, because the temple building was, as I mentioned, one of the wonders of the world. But that by accident, a Roman soldier threw a torch against one of the tapestries, the curtains, and it caught, and the heat was so intense that even the granite, the stone, started to melt and the temple collapsed. Chazal say that Hotzias Chamoso Aloetzim Valavonim. The Rebbeinu Shalom purposely did it. He had the choice, so to speak, to inflict death on the Jewish people or to destroy the temple. So God destroyed the temple and the people would live. The people would live. We've lived in 1948 years. So the Beis HaMikdash began to burn on Tisha B'Av. Most of it burned on the 10th day of Av. That's why even on the 10th day of Av, there's Ksas Avelis that we have. And then 3 years later, the last group of Kanoim who were holed up in Matzada were overcome by the Romans. And that was the end of the rebellion. 60 years later, Bar Kokhba would make a rebellion against the Romans again. He would be successful for 4 years, but eventually he also would be defeated at Beitar, and that would be the end. So until our time, when there was no more Jewish sovereignty in Eretz Yisrael, until our time. So all of that happens in this week, in these days that commemorate it, and days that will be restored to us to Yemei Soson V'Simcha.